to introduce our last but not least speaker, Professor Emerita of Transnational Studies, Bronwyn Winter, lives on the land of the Gadigal and Wangal Peoples of the Eora Nation. She is a long-time feminist, lesbian and trade union activist in France, Australia, briefly in the UK and transnationally. Her interdisciplinary academic work has covered various themes, but addressing various forms of violence against women has always been a core preoccupation. Welcome, Bronwyn. Could you give us some details of your involvement in advocating for women's sex-based rights, please?
Yeah, just a little footnote to what Jessica was saying about Rodney Croome. I've just finished a book which was published earlier this year, giving a feminist critique of the political economy of same-sex marriage. Not so much about the motivations of individuals, but how states and markets appropriate the issue and make themselves look bright and shiny while doing terrible things to lesbians, gays, and women more generally on other levels. Rodney Croome was one of the main advocates, as you surely know, Jessica, for same-sex marriage in Australia. I wonder if he's now calling it same-gender marriage. One can ask the question, because now he's talking about trans rights, so same-sex marriage would not, you'd have to change the lingo. Anyway, that was just a little aside. I am a beneficiary, bizarrely, of the horrible, horrible year of pandemic that was last year, and the horrible, horrible year both staff and students had in our universities all over the country during the pandemic year. I'm sure you've heard about it. It was just awful. People, you know, students fell apart, staff fell apart, we were overworked, we were harassed, we were treated abominably. And I worked at, you know, one of the major G08 universities, so you can imagine how much worse it may have been in others, because it was pretty bad at Sydney. But I got a redundancy package because they were getting rid of staff. I was close to retirement anyway. I said, yeah, sure, I'll take the money and run. So that's been a very, very strange year. To cut the story short, I've been a feminist and lesbian activist since forever. Since I was very young. My older sister was part of the first women's liberation group in Sydney, and I think I owe it to her that that I'm a feminist to a very great extent. I've done all sorts of things. I ended up working at a university sort of by accident, but I decided to work there because I wanted to write and make feminist sense and get paid for it. I thought that would be a good idea. I do want to mention, before I hand the mic back to Janet, I'd actually like to dedicate my participation this evening to a wonderful radical lesbian activist in Quebec by the name of Joanne Coulombe, who died very suddenly and tragically of cancer last week. And she is much mourned across the Atlantic and throughout the Francophone world. And she has been one of a core of very, very active lesbians who in Canada and in Quebec in particular, who have been active around lesbian rights, lesbian sex-based rights, and very critical of gender ideology. Joanne was a wonderful woman, full of grace and humor and generosity. And I just wanted her to be remembered here tonight, because there are casualties of all sorts, and Joanne has been one, unfortunately, to cancer, died far too young.
What made you first realise transgenderism was a threat to women's rights?
You know, Janice Raymond first published The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male in 1979. Some of us thought at the time that she was overstating the case, but in fact she was prophetic. She saw it coming and she was right. I think I was aware of transsexual, transgender transsexuals way back then, and some still call them transsexuals like Miranda Yardley. But I think I was aware it was a threat around 20 years ago, and there were a couple of things happened around that time. First, I was president of my union branch at the University of Sydney around the turn of this millennium. And there was a transgender individual, a student, who beat up a security guard, very tall person, a trans-identified male, and with some serious drug, alcohol, and mental health problems, beat up the security guard, then went to the anti-discrimination board and landed this guy in hospital. Well, he landed this guy in hospital. And the university went to the anti-discrimination board. The university hates being taken to the anti-discrimination board. And the security guards sort of got a little slap on the wrist about it. They got reprimanded. It took another several incidents with this person being drunk and disorderly, trashing student residences and so on, was finally excluded from the university. And that for me was a first big warning sign that it's okay for somebody to be abusive, beat people up, but they can claim that they are transgender minority and persecuted, and everyone sort of shushes it down and quiets it down. That was the first warning bell. Another warning bell was Sappho's Party. Some of you may have heard of Sappho's Party, a lesbian gathering in South Australia. A male to trans individual took action against the party because he wasn't invited. And rather than trying to do anything else, like negotiate, tried to have the whole event shut down. Very, very lengthy litigation ensued. The lesbians won, but it took a long time. It took great lesbian feminist lawyers working pro bono and so on. And there have been constant legal challenges to lesbian space and lesbian gatherings. So those sorts of events. Then there were the Yogyakarta principles, which I can talk about at greater length a bit later. Most of you would know about them. And this sort of seeping into the UN. We had SOGI, or I like to call it SOGI, which is sexual orientation and gender identity, suddenly got lumped together in UN speak. And I thought, okay, we're in a really dangerous place now. This is scary. So that was the mid-2000s that this was happening. So I suppose, and I've never really wanted to work directly on this myself because there are so many other things going on for women in the world, and I felt this was just annoying. But I've been dragged kicking and screaming into talking about it because it has become so dangerous to us. And as Jessica said, it's particularly dangerous to lesbians. It's lesbian erasure.
Is there an area of activity in which you focus your efforts to resist gender identity ideology? Where has that taken you?
Sort of in spite of myself, because I am so annoyed having to give this issue time and attention. Somebody earlier this evening was saying, what the hell, what's it going to take? I think it might have been Anna was saying, what the hell is it going to take? Is it going to be Laurel Hubbard? What's it going to take to peak people? To women in the UK, I say Karen White. Yes, you would all know about the male sexual offender who got himself transferred to a women's prison, and guess what he went and did? And that was a notorious case. I think it might have been in 2017. UK women can correct me if I'm wrong. We have Keira Bell. We have the denunciation of the Tavistock clinic. So I don't know what it's going to take, because those things should have already peaked people. Evie Amati in Sydney, that should have peaked people, but it hasn't. So it's really quite scary. So I've sort of been dragged kicking and screaming, and now kicking and screaming about it. People ask me to talk about it. I was, a lot of you would know of the IQ2 debate that took place in Sydney in 2016, organised by the Ethics Centre in conjunction with the Mardi Gras, because even Mardi Gras was saying, this is going a bit far, we need to talk. And I was thinking, good idea, let's talk. And at that stage, I had some optimism that we would be able to talk and find a way through it, but that optimism has since completely disappeared. I had so much feedback on that Ethics Centre debate from people who were too intimidated to speak out, and said, thank you for speaking. I don't have the courage to. I'm being bullied. My daughter's at university in nursing. She's being told to respect transgender and all about the sorts of things that Madeline would know very, very well about medical care of women and so on. So I thought, well, now I have a responsibility to keep talking about this, because when you start speaking about it, people draw courage from it, people start thinking about it, and maybe people in their own way will also start speaking and acting in their own corners. And it takes a sort of series of little drops, you know, not to make perhaps an ocean, but to make a big wave. I also wanted to acknowledge Lavino talking about the conference in Brisbane. I was aware of that, and I do remember the kerfuffle at the time. I wasn't there, but I do remember the fuss about it. And so yeah, it was happening in the lesbian community in Australia well before this millennium. But yeah, so that's what I do. I talk. I don't want to write about it because it, quite frankly, it gives me the shits to talk about this stuff. It exhausts me. It's intimidating, it's scary. The IQ2 debate was terrifying. I was absolutely terrified getting up on that stage. I'm a bit less scared now because I'm getting so many echoes and good on news, but it's really exhausting to talk about this stuff. It's really exhausting to stand against the tide. And we've just got to keep doing it and doing it together. We can't leave each other alone in front of this.
And of course, the loss of women's studies across Australia began in the 1980s. So that kind of has taken out a lot of women's capacity to learn about this stuff. Can I ask you what kind of opposition you've been facing?
Yes, Liz in Kent, it is indeed very frightening. And I want to thank Janet for raising the lesbian space debate. Somehow I just managed to obliterate that from my memory, but I was completely in the middle of it. So I was part of the committee. We had big debates about it. And the reason I wanted to come back to that is that it completely divided the lesbian community in Sydney at that time. It was quite vitriolic. And what I think frightens me the most about the trans agenda and what it's doing to women is, I have to use the word, the handmaidens. The women who ally themselves with these movements against women. What happened in Sydney in 1993, what happened in Brisbane in 1994, what has happened since in other fora, what happened at the event we held at the University of Sydney last February when trans activists marched in and yelled at us, a number of you were there. It was women screaming at us. It was young women screaming at older women. It was young women pushing women over. I suppose the biggest obstacle, the biggest opposition I face, the men, I expect them to oppose me. I expect the trans activists to oppose me. It's the women that pick up this and carry it forward with such vehemence, such hatred of other women. That is the thing I find the most difficult to deal with. You know, I can get a crank call from a trans or get torn with turf on social media. That's not going to hurt me. But it's these women that, you know, sort of pick up swords and march out to attack other women, like the women on the City of Sydney Council that have, you know, evicted Anna and the Feminist Legal Clinic, and for, you know, when they're doing such terrific work for women, like what's happening to Madeline with breastfeeding, like what's happening to Jessica in Tasmania. It is women who are getting stuck into other women. And that has always undone me. There's not been the only debate we've had in the feminist movement. We've had debates about prostitution and various other things in the feminist movement where women have been vitriolic towards other women. But this takes the cake. And these are the collaborators. There was a conversation about the Nazi regime in which Lorraine was participating in the chat. These are the collaborators, and they're the people who are going to do us in. And they're the people we need to reach and convince and talk to somehow. And I don't know how we do that, but we've got to keep trying.
What are your next steps, and what do you think attendees could be doing?
Well, getting louder, clearly, as Jessica recommends. Jessica mentioned COAL before. That's the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, which is an Australian organisation co-founded by Eileen Pittaway in the think 1993, it was early 90s anyway, and it is one of the few lesbian organizations, it certainly was the first in the world to have special consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the UN. That means we get an in as an NGO to the UN. There are about 5,500 organizations across the world that have that status, from the most bizarrely right wing to the trans to the lesbian and so on, but we're a fairly minority. But anyway, that's what COAL is. So I'm doing some work with them. A little bit, but I was very touched by what some of the people in the chat were saying and what Madeline was saying just now. It is complicated, and women fall for the poor little puppy narrative. They fall for it so easily. We are educated to look after the poor little puppies and the poor little waifs and the poor little men and the poor little everyone except ourselves. And so if someone comes along with a poor little puppy narrative, we fall for it hook, line and sinker. And if some nasty woman says, no, they're not poor little puppies, they're vicious, savage dogs and, you know, should be held back, then they're very loath to believe that. So I suppose, picking up on what Madeleine was saying, it's important to try and reach people where they are. I've tried to do that with students. I've been branded a TERF by some. I have had others really appreciate what I've been trying to say. I no longer have students with whom I have these conversations. I've had it with a lot of my colleagues. A lot of my colleagues are much wiser about this issue in the university. Some of them, a lot of people just don't know what's going on, or they don't want to believe what's going on. So I suppose getting information out there and talking to people in ways that touch them. Somebody talked about being piqued when her daughter, something to do with her daughter. I think it was Sue Gittins in the chat. It's sort of getting that situation that is going to pique people, that is going to get people listening to you. And that's a very, very slow process. It's a one-on-one process. It's a small conversation process. And it's certainly not sort of going out there brandishing, you know, yes, getting out in the street and shouting is important, Jessica, but there are so many other ways in which we need to have these conversations, because people are running away from them. They're either running away from them because they're scared, they don't think they know the issues, they don't think they're across the issues, or they haven't been touched personally by them, or because they've bought the poor little puppy narrative, or because they're just completely confused. And yes, one has to find a way in to try and undo some of that confusion, so people have the space to think about it and to talk about it and not feel judged, but also the space to speak up when they have felt intimidated. As I said before, I think it's really important to let people know, yes, you can speak up and you're not going to die. Or, you know, if you die, we'll die together, but maybe you shouldn't put it that way. But anyway, you can speak up and know this isn't Nazi Germany yet. So yes, you can speak up, and we may be able to change things if we do.